On a narrow balcony in Berlin, a solar panel is zip-tied to a metal railing. The hardware costs exactly $400. It connects directly into an ordinary wall socket, the exact plug used to charge a phone. During periods of direct solar radiation, high-velocity photons strike the panel. They physically displace electrons within the silicon lattice. This thermodynamic reaction generates an immediate kinetic force. It pushes an electrical current backward through the residential wiring. The localized generation mathematically deducts from the centralized utility draw. The physical meter decelerates. It requires no municipal permits. It requires no certified electricians. It requires no external human permission. The Federal Network Agency verifies the data. Over 1 million German households operate this exact mechanism. In the United States, across most geographic zones, this action is strictly prohibited. It is not mechanically impossible. It is legally obstructed. It requires systematic conflict with regional utility corporations and local code enforcement agencies. Who engineered this structural prohibition? A panel, a cord, a standard plug. It is the absolute simplest configuration of photovoltaic technology ever conceived. Yet, it remains restricted in the identical nation that engineered solar arrays for orbital satellites in the 1950s. The architectural reason is not based on physical hazard. This is categorized as a safety protocol. It is not a safety protocol. It is the physical defense of a commercial sequence. It dictates the exact corporate entity authorized to transmit electrons into your structure. It ensures that specific financial transaction repeats, month after month. A forced cyclic loop, continuing until your biological expiration. Observe the mechanics they buried. Examine the baseline biological response to standard solar acquisition. A property owner requests a quote. The resulting number triggers an acute physiological stress response. Exactly $15,000. Exactly $20,000. Exactly $30,000. This capital covers a full rooftop array and chemical battery storage. Then the administrative sequence initiates. It requires a mandatory site survey. It requires a structural engineering review. It requires specialized roof inspections. It requires a municipal permit from the city. It requires an interconnection application submitted to the utility. It requires a secondary physical inspection post-installation. It requires ultimate authorization to close the electrical circuit. This final transmission of administrative approval consumes weeks. Frequently, it consumes months. Digital aggregation platforms document this systemic friction continuously. One user on a data forum documented a precise timeline. 5 months elapsed between finalizing the legal contract and executing the physical connection. The silicon arrays remained bolted to the structural trusses. They absorbed photons. They generated zero output. The local utility had not issued the requisite administrative signature. The occupant paid full retail price for grid power for 5 consecutive months. The physical solution was anchored directly above their coordinates. It was manually deactivated. It waited for ink on a document. That is the baseline regulatory environment for the American populace. Photovoltaic integration is classified as heavy construction. It is defined as a permanent structural modification. It is an operation restricted strictly to property owners possessing optimal credit scores and mathematically precise south-facing roofs. Tenants are denied access. Apartment occupants are geometrically and legally excluded. Exactly 44 million renting households exist within this country. They are systematically blocked from executing this basic thermodynamic conversion. Retain this specific framework in your short-term memory. The capital drain, the administrative load, the human gatekeepers. Now redirect your observation back to that narrow balcony in Berlin. An alternative mechanical pathway exists. It is structurally reduced. It operates with extreme mechanical simplicity. It has functioned without catastrophic failure across millions of units in one of the most highly regulated nations on Earth. The German linguistic classification is Balkonkraftwerk, a balcony power plant. The physical sequence is absolute. Procure 1 or 2 standard solar panels. Route the cables into a localized hardware component. This is the microinverter. It captures the direct current generated by the silicon. It oscillates the electron flow to generate the alternating current required by standard residential infrastructure. The subsequent action shatters American regulatory conditioning. Insert the inverter plug directly into a normal wall socket. The circuit completes. The generated alternating current flows back through the copper wiring of the structure. The active localized loads, the refrigeration compressor, the network router, the tungsten filaments detect the local electron pressure. They consume this immediate kinetic energy first. They drain the free solar power before pulling current from the external grid. The centralized consumption rate drops. The external meter physically decelerates. It requires zero roof penetration. It requires zero certified electricians. It requires zero structural rewiring. Suspend it from a metal railing. Rest it on a flat roof. Lean it against a perimeter fence. Anchor it directly into the soil. In Germany, the legal threshold for these modular units was structurally elevated in 2024. The maximum inverter output was raised to exactly 800 watts. This parameter shift was codified in a legislative framework designated as the solar packet. The administrative registration was previously a high-friction bureaucratic process. It was surgically reduced to a simple digital interface. It is hosted by the Federal Network Agency, the Bundesnetzagentur, a brief time expenditure, a minimal data entry requirement. The legal obligation is met. By early 2025, the Bundesnetzagentur verified over 1 million registered modular systems. Statistical models accounting for unregistered units indicate a significantly larger physical deployment. Over 1 million balconies, quietly executing thermodynamic conversion, entirely within legal parameters. Return to the core inquiry. If this exact physical mechanism is legal and structurally ordinary in Germany, why is it effectively prohibited across the United States? Absolute precision is required here. Precision is the fundamental operating metric of this analysis. Exactly 47 state legislatures did not draft explicit criminal codes targeting balcony solar modules. Legislative mechanics do not operate with that level of visible friction. The prohibition is structurally embedded. The ban operates in silence. It is encoded within the infrastructure guidelines. It exists in the National Electrical Code. Specifically, Article 705 dictates the acceptable physical vectors for connecting any external power source to internal wiring. It exists within the hardware specifications. The underwriter's laboratory's parameters demand that any inverter must be certified exclusively for permanent grid integration by a licensed human technician. It exists within the utility interconnection agreements. This legal contract explicitly blocks bidirectional electron flow within your structure. It requires their proprietary hardware. It requires their direct signature. Combine these three distinct architectural rules. The mathematical sum is an absolute ban. In almost every geographic state, inserting a solar inverter plug into a wall socket triggers a legal failure. You violate the electrical code. You breach the utility contract. Most frequently, you trigger both. A certified modular hardware product does not legally exist for domestic purchase. Until an exact recent date, this was a national absolute. In March of 2025, a structural fracture occurred. The geographic territory of Utah ratified House Bill 340. Governor Spencer Cox applied his signature. Utah became the initial state vector to explicitly legalize modular plug-in photovoltaic hardware. The legislation permitted a maximum electron output of exactly 1,200 watts. This output could be routed through a standard wall socket. It required zero utility oversight. It required zero municipal permits. 1 geographic zone out of 50. The initial fracture in a regulatory architecture that held solid for decades. This confirms the physical reality of the barrier. A legislative key is not required to unlock an empty space. Who engineered the barrier, and for what mechanical purpose? To decode this, analyze the commercial transaction executed during utility payments. You do not purchase the power. You lease the copper pathway. The mechanical meter bolted to the exterior wall is a toll gate. The centralized utility corporation holds absolute ownership of that gate. This specific economic architecture, the metered monopoly, was constructed during the early 20th century. The human operators understood one fundamental economic equation with perfect clarity. The capital does not reside in the energy transfer. The capital resides in the measurement apparatus. It resides in the cyclic financial extraction. It relies on the biological certainty that you will transfer funds next month and the subsequent month until biological expiration. Any localized mechanism that enables autonomous electron generation bypasses their hardware. It bypasses their authorization. This presents an acute structural threat to the toll gate. It is categorized as a safety hazard. It is not a safety hazard. It is a vector of mechanical independence. Objective neutrality is required. This analysis rejects simplified human antagonists. A legitimate physical safety parameter exists deep within the code structures. It requires a clinical, honest examination. The specific threat vector is designated as islanding. The centralized grid suffers a failure state. An atmospheric disturbance or a kinetic impact severs the line. A biological technician ascends a wooden pillar to execute repairs. The technician assumes zero voltage on the copper wire. If localized solar hardware continues to push current into the severed network, it energizes a presumed dead circuit. It sends a lethal kinetic load through human tissue. This is a mathematically verified hazard. This exact threat is weaponized against any occupant attempting autonomous energy generation. The contradiction is physical fact. The engineering solution for this variable was established decades ago. Every contemporary grid-tied microinverter manufactured for this application is bound to a strict parameter. It must meet a specific safety standard within the United States. The classification is UL 1741. Its primary mechanical directive is anti-islanding. The microinverter monitors external grid voltage continuously. The instant the external grid drops to zero, the internal circuit breaks. It executes a complete shutdown within milliseconds. No external grid. No internal output. The hardware physically cannot force current into a dead wire. The German state verified this mechanism across 1 million physical structures. They did not bypass the physics of the hazard. They deployed a superior engineering countermeasure. The German Solar Energy Society developed an exact safety protocol for plug-in systems. They locked the inverter specifications. They defined the exact geometry of the connectors. They hard-coded the mathematical limits. They achieved physical safety. They legalized the thermodynamic flow instead of criminalizing the equipment. The architectural divergence is absolute. One nation classified the homeowner as an autonomous unit requiring proper tools. The other classified the homeowner as a systemic liability requiring containment. If your cognitive tracking remains engaged, your data model is now superior to standard American homeowners. You understand the structural reason your roof is empty while a Berlin balcony quietly operates. To aggregate this complete schematic, you require exact parameters. The precise inverter specifications demanded by safety protocols. The structural divide between grid-tied and isolated architectures. The exact mechanical function of anti-islanding circuits. How to visually read your own electrical panel prior to hardware acquisition. The current jurisdictional status mapped state by state. The exact, code-compliant methodology currently deployed by active users. This entire dataset is compiled into a single, highly compressed manual. Zero artificial inflation. Only the physical facts. The copper wiring. The legislative code. The safety parameters. The document is titled the Cool House Codex. For expanded operational depth, there is the complete field edition. These units transition the theory into physical execution. They are engineered for the occupant who rejects systemic management. The occupant ready to process the mechanics. The acquisition cost is exactly $97. It is the highest yield $97 you will allocate toward actual thermodynamic independence. It serves as the technical companion to the subsequent breakdown. The analysis will now isolate the exact physical mechanics. The required capital expenditure. The precise geometric environments where this equation balances. Isolate the fundamental physics. The corporate entities systematically obscure the thermodynamics. The flow of electrical current mirrors fluid dynamics in closed plumbing. The external grid operates as a highly pressurized municipal water main. You activate a switch. You open a mechanical valve. Fluid draws from the high-pressure source. The localized meter mathematically records every unit of volume. A plug-in solar apparatus functions as a secondary local reservoir equipped with an autonomous pump. Solar radiation hits the surface. The internal pump injects physical pressure directly at the socket insertion point. Localized hardware responds to the path of least electrical resistance. The appliances consume this immediate, localized pressure first. They drain the unmetered kinetic load before pulling the corporate load. The external grid merely backfills the thermodynamic deficit. The silicon generates exactly 400 watts. The structural load requires exactly 600 watts. You extract exactly 200 watts from the external turnstile. The silicon generates exactly 800 watts. The structural load requires exactly 300 watts. The surplus electron pressure reverses outward through the copper to the meter. This is the entire functional principle. This does not sever your physical structure from the grid. This is not total isolation. It calculates a mathematical offset against the baseline structural draw, the constant, invisible kinetic vibration of the building, the thermodynamic cycling of the refrigeration compressor, the continuous data processing of the router, the idle voltage holding in a dozen hardware units. This phantom electrical load operates 24 hours a day. Regardless of human presence, this invisible load consumes massive volume. Analytical models of structural energy consumption consistently verify this baseline state. Always-on equipment devours a massive percentage of total structural throughput. A minimal, continuous kinetic injection targeting this specific baseline alters the entire mathematical outcome. It operates continuously. It pushes constant pressure against the most rigid parameter of your financial extraction. Isolate the economic metrics. Vague statistical models exist strictly to force the acquisition of a $30,000 system. A baseline European hardware cluster, 2 silicon units, and an 800-watt microinverter requires an initial capital transfer of $400 to $800. This scales with mounting variables. An 800-watt array positioned in adequate solar geometry generates between 600 and 800 kilowatt-hours per orbital cycle. At current domestic extraction rates, this physically subtracts between $100 and $200 from the annual financial transfer. The capital recovery period completes in 3 to 6 years. The silicon lattice structures maintain thermodynamic stability. They are certified to maintain 80% operational efficiency for exactly 25 years. The microinverter contains the highest point of mechanical friction. It requires replacement in 10 to 15 years. Transfer a few $100s exactly one time. For over a decade, active kinetic independence flows directly into the internal structure through a wall socket. This exact mechanism cannot be monetized twice. There is zero recurring financial extraction for hardware secured to a railing. There is zero corporate meter attached to the local star. This is the structural flaw. This, above any theoretical thermal event, dictates why this basic physics problem is restricted in an economy engineered exclusively on the repeating charge. Isolate the mechanical friction points, the legitimate engineering anomalies, the baseline interrogations required before executing this integration. Does a reverse electrical feed into a standard socket compromise structural integrity? This is the precise epicenter of the American regulatory blockade. The hazard calculation contains 2 distinct vectors. Vector 1 is the external grid failure state. The protection of biological technicians during line repair. This is structurally neutralized by the certified microinverter. The hardware severs the connection. The instant external voltage drops to 0. Vector 2 focuses on internal thermal limits. Standard residential copper circuits and mechanical breakers operate under single-direction flow parameters. The breaker monitors the intake. It protects the copper from critical thermal overload. Injecting localized power at the socket routes current directly behind the monitoring breaker. If the copper pathway sustains heavy simultaneous loads, the physical wiring will subsequently carry kinetic force, exceeding the breaker's mathematical threshold. The copper overheats. This is a legitimate engineering fact. This is the mechanical reality behind the National Electrical Code restrictions. This is a physics equation. It cannot be ignored. The German engineering countermeasure restricted the maximum output. Exactly 800 watts generates a manageable thermal load. They regulated the exact geometry of the physical connection. Certain structural configurations require a specialized socket and an isolated copper circuit. They reject randomized plug insertion. The mathematical details dictate survival. This structural knowledge is mandatory prior to hardware deployment. You must mathematically map the main panel. You must trace the internal copper paths. If data is incomplete, you must contract a licensed biological technician. The acquisition cost of an electrician is a fractional rounding error compared to the thermal combustion of your primary structure. You will not receive instructions to bypass municipal codes. You will receive the absolute fact that the thermal physics are sound. The localized hazards possess verified mechanical solutions. A single geographic state legalized the integration safely. The required trajectory is physical accuracy. It is applying friction to the legislative bodies. It is not operating hidden circuits behind combustible drywall. Will the thermodynamic conversion function at your exact spatial coordinates? The physics rely entirely on two inputs: solar radiation density and physical orientation. A silicon lattice aligned precisely south in the high radiation environments of Arizona or Colorado captures maximal kinetic transfer. A unit oriented north beneath heavy atmospheric moisture in the Pacific Northwest captures a fraction of that baseline. The statistical reality is absolute. The geographic zone of Germany possesses lower annual radiation metrics than the entire continental United States. The thermodynamic equation still balances mathematically. If the physical conversion operates in Hamburg, it operates in Ohio. The sole requirement is direct atmospheric exposure, a direct line of sight to the local star, zero biological obstruction from trees, zero structural occlusion from adjacent buildings. A physically blocked photon cannot generate electron flow. Are the capital requirements accurate, or are negative financial variables concealed? The mechanical hardware costs exactly a few $100s. The concealed cost within the American system is purely administrative friction. In the majority of jurisdictions, no certified modular hardware exists for legal deployment. The drain is not physical capital. The drain is the unresolved legal void. Within Utah, that physical void closed. In external regions, you wait for the legislative shift. Alternatively, you deploy capital to hire an electrician and force an administrative utility formalization. This destroys the economic advantage. What is the physical degradation rate, and how does the mechanism respond to planetary rotation? The silicon lattice endures for decades. During heavy atmospheric interference, the localized electron generation drops. It does not hit zero. During the nocturnal cycle, it hits absolute zero. The basic modular architecture contains no chemical storage battery. You do not warehouse kinetic potential. You merely execute a real-time subtraction against active daylight loads. This is statistically optimal. The massive baseline thermal loads the compressor, the network hardware, the atmospheric cooling systems run actively during the solar window. You synchronize autonomous unmetered generation directly against peak financial extraction hours. Integrating chemical battery storage is mechanically possible. It instantly multiplies both capital requirements and physical complexity. That is a separate physical analysis. Identify the human actors forcing this integration. The primary variable is not the hardware. It is the biological persistence rejecting the illegality of basic physics. In the San Francisco Bay Area, Brightsaver executed formation. They are a non-governmental organization operating with absolute focus. They exist to force modular solar into the United States, to clone the German thermodynamic model, to deploy physical test modules, to apply political friction for legal alteration, to grant standard tenants the exact physical capabilities operating in Berlin. A commercial entity designated Gizmo Power engineered a mobile plug-in solar structure. They initiated direct collaboration with Underwriters Laboratories, the exact organization whose parameters enforce the blockade. They are engineering a legal certification pathway, a mechanical standard designated UL 3741. This parameter could authorize a modular product across the national grid. They secured data support from the Department of Energy. The department verified modular solar as a delivery vector for standard renters. The millions mathematically excluded from heavy roof infrastructure. Then, observe Utah. House Bill 340. The initial fracture. Legislative units processed the German data. They processed the safety metrics. They processed the populations locked out of the thermodynamic loop. They calculated the administrative gatekeeping was structurally inefficient. This is the recurring operational pattern. The mechanical data is intact. The silicon technology is present. The physical laws function. The administrative authorization is the sole absent variable. And authorization is not bound by physics. It alters with a signature. The technology did not fail a mechanical test. It was systematically suppressed. It was administratively buried. It was extracted from the operational code. It did not fail. It simply lacked the capacity for cyclic financial extraction. A panel on a railing generates zero recurring revenue. Establish the exact operational limits. Precise limit definition ensures data integrity. This hardware does not replace the centralized utility. A modular system cannot sustain the entire structural load. It will not maintain voltage during a grid collapse. The safety circuit triggers. The internal relay breaks. It terminates electron output entirely. It will not reduce your financial extraction to absolute zero. Claims contradicting these physical limits are commercial deceit. The mechanism provides a calculated mathematical offset. A vector for a tenant to control local generation. A vector for an apartment occupant to systematically deduct kilowatt hours from the exterior meter. A vector for a property owner to deploy minimal capital. To execute generation without assuming massive structural debt. The equation optimizes under specific conditions. It requires uninterrupted solar radiation. It requires active daylight consumption loads. It requires jurisdictional authorization or a certified biological technician. If you occupy a lease structure, audit the legal contract. Locate the exact clauses governing external hardware. If you hold property ownership, map the electrical panel geometry before any hardware acquisition. The optimal strategic protocol is standard. Memorize the engineering parameters. Monitor the regional legislative data. Reject any physical integration involving unverified internal wiring. The objective is not chaotic hardware deployment. The objective is data superiority. To hold exact knowledge of the mechanism actively trusted by 1 million German operational units, when the regulatory architecture fractures in your geographic zone, you execute the integration. Safely. Process the Berlin balcony coordinates one final time. The silicon on the railing. The copper routed to the socket. The mechanical meter decelerating under active photon bombardment. 0 structural engineers mobilized. 0 massive capital transfer executed. 0 corporate entities extracting a fee from thermodynamic physics. The systemic conditioning operated for decades. It dictated autonomous generation required massive scale, heavy capital, permanent structural modification, a mechanical operation strictly for the upper economic strata possessing optimal geometry. This was mathematically false. The reduced configuration operated continuously. It bypassed the commercial meter. Therefore, it was systematically withheld. The mechanical data was intact. It was simply unmarketed. Now the data is yours. The fundamental historical law of energy distribution is absolute. The entities controlling the physical turnstile dictate alternative mechanics are physically impossible. They maintain this artificial reality until a single geographic jurisdiction shatters it. Identify your structural parameters. Do you hold ownership or lease the structure? What is the exact compass orientation of your exterior surface? Does it intercept direct, unobstructed solar radiation? These variables calculate the viability of the thermodynamic loop. They define if local legislation is the solitary remaining friction point, if the centralized utility structurally delayed activation of hardware you legally possess, map that operational timeline as well. If you recognize this pattern of administrative suppression, if you identify the legislative protection of cyclic financial extraction, track the next data sequence. I will deconstruct the mechanical history of net metering, the exact policy calculating the mathematical value of localized generation, the specific tactics deployed by utilities to extract that value, the precise chronological year the architecture shifted against the individual. The photon transfer was always mathematically free. The sole capital cost was the administrative authorization to intercept it. Now you hold the parameters. Load one final metric into your processor. It supersedes every numerical value provided. The 20th century grid architecture was engineered for maximum mass. Centralized combustion facilities, high voltage transmission networks, expanding capital extraction. The localized structure was positioned as the absolute terminal point, the final node where kinetic energy is mathematically recorded. You were structurally categorized as a pure consumer, a static point of financial extraction. The modular panel deletes this architecture. It is the smallest verified unit of mechanical autonomy. One silicon panel, one copper cord, one standard socket. This is the exact physics causing systemic structural panic within a centralized monopoly. Germany codified the reduced mechanics. Utah executed the initial domestic override. The final variable is the subsequent geographic state to follow. Track the jurisdiction you occupy. Calculate if the legal parameters shift before the next cycle of peak thermal extraction. Monitor the legislative codes. Memorize the engineering standards. Map your internal copper. When the wall cracks where you live, execute the connection.